Hey everyone, this is Parthi from Letterdrop. Today on the show we have Greg Costigan, if I'm saying that right, Greg.
You're
And
saying it right. It's good.
I met Greg at a pavilion dinner a couple weeks ago in San Francisco, and we started talking just about like go-to-market and sales for early stage companies. We started talking a little bit about some of the stuff Letterdrop's doing for sales teams and kind of what Greg has seen out in the market as well. Greg has seen every stage of startup pretty much. He was an AE at some names that you're probably familiar with, like Box, Zora, Zenefits. And since then, he has also led sales teams at companies all the way from under a million to over 10 million in ARR. And so I'm really excited to talk to Greg a little bit about that kind of revenue journey for companies, what it means to build those kinds of sales motions, problems, challenges, things to look out for in this conversation today. Greg, thanks for joining us today. Anything else you want to add to that introduction?
Appreciate you having me. 100,000. That was the only thing. We haven't hit 100 million yet, Parthi, on the revenue range. But I got you. Yeah.
Gotcha, gotcha. Awesome, Greg. Well, tell me a little bit more about how you think about that journey of sales, going from like really early stages to let's call it like the $10 million range or something along those
Sure.
lines. What is changing all the way from founder-led sales to hiring your first AE to building up a sales motion at the different stages?
Yeah, good question. It's a popular topic. I think there's almost like subsets, I would say, in that regard, right? Like I think the first big bridge that you cross is like your first hire. So let's just spend a minute there. So if you think about founder led sales, whether it's YC or otherwise, I mean, you have this incredible energy, this mission, this infectious story, this ability to just, you know, tell something and almost like will your way into sales cycles and into revenue. A lot of times there's close personal connections either via advisors or investors or boot camps that you're able to have really warm introductions on. I think like one of the things I like to say from this early stage is like don't lose the magic. So don't lose that magic. Don't become too process driven yet. Like it's still fluid. So when I think about the stages, I really think about the first bridge as being your first hire. So going from a founder led sales to like a Navy SEAL of an individual or a player coach or someone that you want to hire. And how do you basically translate all that energy and positive infectious mission into that first person so that they can speak the same language as you? That's tough. It's hard, right? And it's hard in some ways for founders to like let go of the reins and trust the process a little bit. But I think there's a lot of mechanisms that can help you not lose that magic. So it's sort of like gate one, I would call it. You know, gate two is when you see some of that success. And again, this can be like pre-seed, it can be seed stage, and that salesperson, whether it's a leader or a player coach or even an IC, you start to look to bring someone else on. It's usually north of a million in revenue, and at that point, you start to think a little bit about capacity and coverage and pipeline coverage and conversion rates and that kind of stuff. Now, I would encourage everyone not to get too scientific just yet, but you can become a little more scientific in the way that you approach when you have more than one person. The only other thing I'll say on top of all this is really just like, I think there's a really big discussion around ICP and being like ruthlessly focused. I know we're covering a lot on one question here, but at this stage, certainly early stage and probably all the way up to 10 million, you want to be pretty ruthless on your ICP. There's a gentleman named TK who's got a lot of YouTube videos and he's the founder of Tout App. He uses this term called initial customer profile. And I like that. And I like that for founders because I think sometimes when you going through the exercise of defining an ICP, it feels limiting. But the coaching that he gives that I really like is it's not TAM. You're not qualifying the TAM at this point. And you're really just going after that initial customer profile. And I like that.
Yeah, I like that too. And it's really a question of making sure that the founders choose the right initial customer profile and proving
Mm-hmm.
that out at the basic level before they bring on like more people and try to actually scale that operation. It's really hard to scale something that um, isn't fundamentally working. You're just putting more money and time and resources behind something where it's not quite clicking. So I do
Hmm.
like that. In terms of scaling out that operation,
Hmm.
um, what are the biggest hurdles when you start like bringing in like more AEs, more sellers, and expanding the team beyond just like prep and like the founder energy that you mentioned?
Sure.
What are the other kinds of challenges you think most companies start
Yeah.
running into?
I see two buckets of the challenge. Number one is like your pipeline, your demand gen.
Yeah,
Are you bringing enough interest in that stuff that so there's almost this chasm component, which is that first meeting. When I work with a lot of founders in my business or even just prior, there's anything north of that first meeting, right? And at the highest level, maybe it's like website hits, but there's a lot of like intent and interest and signal, and it's all the motions that go into getting that first meeting. Once you've got that first meeting, there's an efficiency component that goes to like first meeting to deal closed. So I sort of segment your question into two like sub segments, right? It's interesting. I don't have like a great answer. I would say it's both. What I find when I work with some founders is they say we don't have a big problem. Let's call it generating leads. I hear that a lot, or generating interest, whether it's a podcast or whether that's webinars or whether it's community. The thing that happens sometimes is if you're doing a lot of say informational interviews or you're doing a lot of give me feedback on my product, it's crossing that line to like actually getting folks in like interested parties that are going to like maybe look at making a purchase decision. That's tough, right? There's some components that you need to cross there. I'm working with one founder right now that doesn't have an issue with anything. So that's kind of the opposite. Doesn't have an issue of when he gets people into the first meeting. It's just a matter of like, how do we get more folks into the first meeting? So I'm sort of kind of half answering your question pertaining to like, bandwidth of individuals, but I see two clearly delineated issues that come up when you're at this stage. One is generating more first meetings. And the other one is, if you're going to, what's the efficiency rate that you're closing those at?
gotcha, gotcha.
Yeah.
Let's talk about both of those individually, in fact, right? So when we're talking about generating first meetings, a lot of companies will either have a full cycle AE or a
Hmm.
dedicated like BDR, SDR,
Yep.
and they're just like hitting the phones, cold emailing, cold LinkedIn DMing, whole bunch of stuff to try to generate pipeline. And there are different ways in which you can be a little bit more efficient about this in
Sure.
terms of actually looking for triggers and trying to tailor your messaging
Yep.
based on observations you're seeing around businesses publicly and all that kind of stuff. But what would you say are um, the biggest levers that a sales team has in terms of actually trying to build that pipeline so that they get first meetings?
I know there's a lot of talk in like 2024 around, is the BDR rule dead? Is everything going to go AI? Look, there might be the ages of just hiring, dozens and hundreds of BDRs. Maybe that for smaller orgs is maybe gone, but I see so much value. Full cycle, fine, but the BDR motions, like in an enterprise B2B sales, like the term I would use casually, Parthi, would be like wrangling. You're still wrangling a lot of folks, right? Thoughtfully wrangling. How about that? But there's motions that need to happen that convert like interest into action. And I think that there's a lot of plays that still like a human, a thoughtful BDR or SDR is going to have to do. You can make an argument whether it's going to be an AE, but I would just say in the companies that I've worked with, and even some of the folks that I'm doing some consulting work with right now, having like an A plus BDR makes a world of difference. There's so much information that's going to sit in your CRM. There's so much on your LinkedIn, right? There's so much in your outreach or your Apollo instance. If you're thinking about Signal or even just anyone that's like clicking on emails or on your LinkedIn page or liking stuff socially, there's a lot there that if you take the next level of action on in a thoughtful way, it's going to make such a world of difference. And if you're not doing that and you're sort of like trusting the system, I think you're going to be missing a lot. So I'm going to advocate for that. I'm also going to advocate, in addition to, that whole notion of like full cycle reps. Like if you don't have a full, I'm a pretty big advocate, and you need full cycle reps. You need reps that are going to be AEs that are going to be doing their own prospecting, even if you have a BDR in seat. I think you need to have some ownership and accountability there. I kind of had a rule of thumb at Hone, one of the companies that I was VP of sales at. AEs had to generate 25% of their own pipeline. It was just it was a number that we modeled based on how we progressed, but that actually translated in a number of meetings, into a number of activities, all that kind of stuff. I think it's a good like framework for something for folks to come up with, because then you can kind of set a number and go at it. So kind of two answers in there. One is I'm a big fan of the BDR role and the plays that they can run. And two is you need full cycle reps, and they have to be responsible for at least a quarter of their pipe.
Gotcha. And for BDRs, you talked about these kind of signals. Talked about LinkedIn. You talked about emails.
Mm-hmm.
All of this is kind of dependent on you actually having some sort of like marketing
Sure.
in place, right? Marketing is essentially generating the surface area for you to collect
Sure.
these signals
Mm-hmm.
um, out there. So how do you think like the BDR or the person prospecting has to really interface with marketing to make sure that they're actually leveraging those signals instead of being like, like here's a target list. I'm just going to go after that
For sure.
completely independently of whatever marketing's doing.
Yeah. Look, I mean, you're sort of leading the witness a little bit, right? But like
Yeah.
the best companies out there, it's a, you know, these two things are combined, right? Like even the best outbound campaigns, even if you're using the best copy or multi-touch via, email, call, link, voice notes. I mean, like we've all been sold to, right? And a lot of times from a cold, like a cold buyer standpoint, there's this massive credibility gap in your mind. No matter how good the message is or how personal it is, you're still going to do your research from it, right? You're going to go, well, who is this person? Like, you're going to go look at the site, or you're going to look at like what they're saying. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think whether there's sophisticated product marketing in place for an early stage company, like maybe TBD, but there has to be something, right? There has to be like a nice landing page on products on your website, or something that you're speaking about, thought leadership or commercial insights on your LinkedIn, anything pertaining to that, that's going to just close the credibility gap. So you're providing like grease for when the BDR goes out there and starts to develop some stuff. Because I think a lot of times the BDR is, these motions like outbound email, in my experience, especially today, it's not necessarily going to generate the meeting, right? Someone, especially senior buyers, they're not going to say, wow, I got this email, I'm happy to take a a 15-minute call with a BDR. It's not really the case. It might have been 10 years ago, but it's not the case anymore. What they're going to do is you're trying to build that awareness funnel. You're trying to drive them to a center of excellence that's going to close that credibility gap, where they'll either A, take action, or B, you can follow up with them and kind of nudge them along taking action. So yeah, I'm advocating for whatever you're implying, but there has to be some marketing there, or else it's just not going to work.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of the buyer, like somebody mentioned this earlier, like
Mm-hmm.
if when someone's taking a meeting with you, they've honestly done 70% of their research already.
Definitely.
They've checked out your site, they've seen your stuff on LinkedIn, they've probably seen
Mm-hmm.
ads somewhere, they saw like a sponsorship on a newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
They heard somebody else talking about you. They're coming in not because they had nothing better to do on a Tuesday afternoon than
Sure.
sit down and take a demo, but because they probably have some sort of relevant or related problem, and they're hoping that you can solve that for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I see the BDR, the SDR, as essentially the person who's kind of like closing that gap
Yeah.
from like, hey, I'm generally aware that I have this problem, and
Mm-hmm.
I've heard of you, to
Mm-hmm.
actually being like, okay, like now is the time to actually sit down and maybe look into actively solving it.
Mm-hmm.
And this person is essentially just providing that bridge for me to fix that. Something you talked about, which I thought was really
Mm-hmm.
interesting, was the credibility gap.
Mm-hmm.
And over here at Letter Drop, I get our entire go to market team to practice this. We are posting constantly on LinkedIn. Our sellers, our
Mm-hmm.
A, our PDR, they're posting at least 3 times a week on LinkedIn.
Nice. Mm-hmm.
And it's all like informational, educational stuff. It's stuff like, hey, so the prospect asked me this on a call. Like, here was my answer. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
talking about it more publicly.
Mm-hmm.
Or here's a great blog post, or a guide that
Mm-hmm.
our marketing team put together. I'm just like sharing it out with the world. Here's a great case study, all this kind of stuff.
Sure.
And one of the byproducts of that is when our BDR or anybody when they get on the phone with somebody, people are like, I've seen you before,
Definitely.
or I've heard of you. you've got 30 seconds, go for
Hmm.
it. And so I've seen that work really well for it. We actually measured it and we saw a sort of like somewhere
Really?
between 8 and 16% increase in our connect rate, reply rate.
Okay.
But I feel like when I go out and I talk to the vast majority of sellers, it's just blank.
Hmm.
There is no that credibility doesn't at least seem publicly visible.
Hmm.
And so I'm curious as to your take on this because I know in our last conversation you
Hmm.
mentioned a social selling office hours that you ran.
Hmm.
So tell
Hmm.
me a little bit more about the motivation behind that. Like, why was it important?
Hmm.
And what worked, what didn't work?
Yeah. It's power hours. We did social power hours when I was at home. So I think like we had a rule, right, internally that at least 3 times a week, and there's calendar invites. Like if you're managing a sales team, think if you got 10 AEs, I don't know, 5 BDRs, STR manager, a couple sales managers. Everyone gets busy throughout the week, right? And you can kind of set rules and set parameters and sort of go into like maybe a Series A or B style company, which Hone was. But you know, there's look, it's just habits, right? It's like habit forming and like the habits that you're trying to have. And we all know LinkedIn, right? And but like LinkedIn has to be thoughtful and credible, and it has to be organic, it has to be authentic, it can't be cringe, right? Like you have to be posting stuff, but it also has to be stuff of value. So there's two rules that we had at home, like post 3 times a week. Fine, there's calendar invites for it. And I think a lot of folks, and a lot of folks took that pretty seriously. Now, as far as like what you're going to post, of course, there's a ton of stuff that comes from marketing. There's events, there's podcasts, and those are very good assets. However, the stuff that would trend the most was usually something thoughtful that was organically written by the rep. That takes, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes to think about it. You got to sit down, you got to think about how I'm going to write this, and like what kind of message it's going to convey. So there's two answers to your question. The first thing is we had a rule you had to post 3 hours, 3 times a week, and those are like calendar invites. What we found is that in any organization there's learnings that happen, right? And even in a small org, folks want to kind of share. You can talk about stuff on Slack, whatever, but like, look, what the big magic, the big unlock, we do a half an hour a week, and it was just a social power hour. And I know a lot of companies back in the day would do cold call power hours. No one looked forward to it. So this was social power hour, and it was more fun, and people had fun, and we had little prizes and games and spiffs. But you know what it was? There was certain rules. It was find a couple influencers. This is in the buyer persona that the AEs or the SDRs were after. Go and find them and follow them. If appropriate, connect with them, like or comment on their posts. At least like become knowledgeable of what they're after, but also engage with them. So that was one. The second thing was, post content yourself. So, a lot of times folks are looking for inspiration around what content you want to post. So I found that the social power hours were really helpful around that. And what we found in those power hours is it's like, look, you grab a coffee, everyone's on the Zoom, you're all kind of like looking at each other. It's an office environment. There's some good energy that gets going. People start commenting, they start posting. And then believe it or not, you're going to start trending a little more positively on LinkedIn as well. So I have a couple kind of follow up comments to that, but it was a nice energy that got brought to the team. And frankly, I think it made a pretty big difference in the way that we generate pipeline.
Talk to me a little bit more about that latter point in terms of generating
Mm-hmm.
pipeline, because if you just said what you said to a lot of sales leaders, I do feel like the objection is if my sellers are not on a call with a
Yeah.
prospect right now, that is time wasted. Any
Yeah.
activity that is not them on a call with a prospect is time wasted.
Yeah.
And so I think it's very easy for people
Mm-hmm.
to think about these actually high leverage activities,
For sure.
scalable high leverage activities. Like you're hitting like
Mm-hmm.
many hundreds of thousands of prospects by doing this, but
Yeah.
even if you don't see it, so they would dismiss it. So tell me a little bit more about the results you saw from
Mm-hmm.
on pipeline from your social power hours
For sure.
and how you would maybe respond to a sales leader who says that to you.
Yeah. It's interesting. I would say like don't lose sight of the forest through the trees, right? Like now I know we're all impatient. We all want like, results immediately. But I would say there's two things. I'll get to your pipeline question in a sec. In addition to that, the level of acumen of the folks that are actually doing the posting and like doing the social power hours just goes through the roof. Like if you think about it as an individual seller, even if you're new to the organization, new to the company, not the founder, Sure, maybe you have like affinity towards the mission, you know the space, you know the product, you know the competitors, but there's still like a slight nudge of intrinsic knowledge and maybe even confidence that has to develop in that person for them to be not a salesperson, but to be like a SME in that department, be a subject matter expert, to be like treated as a source of truth, close that credibility gap, be a business advisor. And you know what's going to have, you know what's going to cause that is at bats, right? Like at bats is going to cause that. Now, there's at bats on sales calls, but like going and posting on LinkedIn and commenting, like you can get to CHROs, like we were in an L&D spend, you can get to a CHRO of a Fortune 100 company, and you can actually interact with this person on LinkedIn. Like, what better source of validation of whether your tone and your message is appropriate or not than that? So it's sort of like an enablement training related byproduct of doing this, but it definitely raised the acumen of our folks. So it almost raised their credibility. So that's one. Two, look, Parthi, we were, to answer your question around the pipeline, we were territory based, right? So a big part of it was enterprise, mid market, and then geographic territories. And a big part of that was, the relationships of folks that you had in those territories. So what we ended up finding is that, in the first social selling hour, for instance, I don't know if there was an actual like lead that came in, it turned into an opportunity. But in the second or third, we were interacting with people that were either in our closed lost funnel or people that we had in our CRM or just, random disparate sources of information that were now engaging with us. And so it led to, I'd have to like dig out the actual numbers, but a lot of large deals came back or interested parties came in and is actually like net new opportunity creation. So yeah, is there an opportunity cost of going to a half an hour, getting your entire org on a jam session for a half an hour? For sure. But like, I don't know, it's completely worth it in my humble opinion. So you got to do it.
I love it. And I also love how you talk about getting your sellers to be business consultants,
Sure.
essentially, right?
Hmm.
And I imagine this matters a lot more as ACV trends up and like the sale becomes like less transactional,
Hmm.
and you're actually trying to convince somebody or help somebody understand like how to solve their big business problem, get
Sure.
from A to magic place B, and then your solution somehow fits along in that
Hmm.
journey. But tell me a little bit more about how you think sellers should maybe be thinking about how they can be consultative. I think the last time we chatted, we
Yeah.
talked about this where um, like a CHRO, like why should they trust a
Yeah.
random AE, right? Like what do they know about running their business? So
Totally.
how do you sort of think about sellers kind of like closing that gap and being able to actually impart business advice or be able to be
Hmm.
that consultant and show that CHRO
Hmm.
how they can like go from A to B with your solution?
Totally. A lot of it's challenger sale. Like a lot of it is just like I'm a big challenger proponent for folks that have read it. And there's a follow up called the Challenger Customer, which talks a lot about internal mobilizers and like buying cycles. So like definite plug for both of those. So a lot of the science is documented there. But I think like that's the key point, right? Is that two things. First of all, the seller is going to have a seller brand as well, right? So, the organization that, that you're representing, especially in the early stage, you're closing a credibility gap in the mind of the buyer just around like your stage and your company brand and the risk that they might be taking by making a purchase decision with that. But number two is the seller is going to have a brand, right? So that, the buyer is going to want to feel like, sure, an affinity in a relationship, but they're going to want, I think of like a trusted set of hands is kind of the analogy that I think of. And the buyer's going to want to kind of feel it. They're trusted through like a credible journey where they've been presented all options and they've been guided, and then they're able to make like an optimal decision at the end. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying there is that what I've always tried to instill in my team is that you have to be like a market expert and a product expert. Like you almost can't have enough market expertise and your actual product expertise. And then you just have to you have to sort of have an opinion, have a hypothesis, fine, thoughtfully challenge. When I worked at Mind Gym, the CEO used to always say, he's like, think like doctors when we're going in to diagnose the patient, right? And every time you go into a sales call, just think about like, how are you diagnosing them or what recommendations might you have? But you can't do those if you're not credible. So, I mean, there's a ton of research out there in Gartner, CB, and Challenger that this is what, sellers are going to make a difference on. But you have to be consultative. You have to have a bit of an opinion and you got to have some credibility. And the final thing I'll say on this, there's actually a lot of stats on this, is that especially in the early stage, in any stage company, still, I think I read a stat on Gartner that 53% of all buying decisions are still going to be tied to the seller experience. And this is for any stage org. And I'd have to go and find the footnote for you. But irregardless of product and all that, 53%, so more than 50% is still going to be tied to the seller experience. In an early stage startup, you know, you're winning or losing based on sales excellence, really, because you're probably going to have a good website and you might have a couple early stage customers, but you're probably still at a disadvantage to the incumbents. So like it's even more important that you're differentiating on sales excellence. So go and do it.
And for your average seller, how do you think they can get to that sales excellence? They can understand the market, they can
Mm-hmm.
understand the product to a certain degree. What
Yeah,
are ways in which you can show up in a call or post call
sure.
and just instill that level of confidence in your buyer?
Yeah, a lot of it's prep. you know, I sort of talk about like product expertise and market expertise, those two things. So like as the individual, especially in an early stage, you're going to have to go and learn. Put the onus on yourself to go and learn those. A lot of times, folks are going to say there's enablement and stuff, or training internally at an org for sure. But in an early stage company, you should have like an intrinsic motivation to learn as much as you can about those two things. Now that's your critical level of knowledge. As far as the call goes, you got to have a call plan before every call, especially these important ones. I've done podcasts in the past where I've talked about give get goal for coming on a call. Just write it out. Be plain to yourself. Take 10, 15 minutes even right before the call. Get in the zone and write down your give, your get, your goal. What's external and what's like internal, and even if it's audacious. So you have like a guiding light for that call. When you're on that call, like folks are unfortunately going to be judging you, and you have to be better in the competition. So you have to be more credible, more assertive, more more expertise, and then keep the agenda on track. So I have this, and I find that having that stuff ahead of time is important. So if you're going to do the prep ahead of time, as far as your knowledge, you're going to be prepared for the call. You're going to have your give get goal, and you have a really good call. I would say the only final thing there is like have a process. So like think about like how you're recommending folks to get through a buying process. Even like savvy buyers, sophisticated buyers might have not bought what you're selling before, so they don't know how to. So just have like recommended steps, something for them to react to while they go through that process. So, I don't know. As far as like once you've done all those things, or like the foundational things, I'll give you one more answer and then maybe we can pause. But like it's a lot around. You got to watch the game film. So if you're using Gong or using Clary or whatever you're using, go in and watch yourself and go in and watch what you've done and the reactions to those folks. There, because you can have the best plan going into any call, but you're going to have to watch how stuff goes live. So set up the foundation, the structure, prepare for the call, and then watch your game film and make changes based on that afterwards.
Absolutely. I sit down with our AE all the time, every week actually, and I just go through like we can't go through every call, but we'll go through like one
Mm-hmm.
or two calls, and I'll just be like, here's an observation of like how they're reacting. Like maybe you didn't notice it in the moment, but actually when we go back and watch this, you can see that they're hesitating, they're not being forthcoming, like you didn't establish trust, whatever it may be.
Sure.
That definitely comes out. And I think everything around education, customer education, and anything you can do in sales enablement to make your customer feel like, hey, like this is the right choice. Everything
Mm-hmm.
from like prepping the demo to sharing, like understanding their questions in the call and being able to, even in your follow up, just saying like, hey, like I heard those questions and I gave you the best answer in the call, but I actually did
Sure.
my homework and here's exactly what you need
Definitely.
afterwards. Everything just moves towards like building that credibility and closing that credibility gap that you mentioned. Last question before we wrap up. What is one thing you feel like most VPs of sales should do? And let's assume this is like a Series A
Mm-hmm.
company, like that type of stage,
Mm-hmm.
that they aren't doing that. You feel like the vast majority of folks are not doing right now. And if they just did this one thing, it would just be a game changer for them.
I think feedback and coaching, it's a perpetual area of improvement. I would not say that. I think most VPs of sales would say I do it, or they think they do, but I think the exceptional ones are rare. And I just think about my career as well. I think of the times that I've really made it a priority to spend time watching the Gong or reviewing reactions or giving feedback or providing coaching. Like in an early stage org, especially, like I think those are the biggest differentiators. You know, I talked a lot about like process and enablement and stats, absolutely. But if you over index on that, and I've actually been guilty of that myself, you can become a little too operational. To close the credibility gap, it really is about the the magic that's going to happen in the seller and the buyer's mind. So like, I guess the one thing I would challenge all VPs of sales to do, because I know it's tough and I've been there, because you have to get your weekly reports in, and the CEO's breathing down your neck, and pipeline's short, and conversion rates are off, and the board meeting's next week, and the enablement material can use a design refresh. I get it. But the most important thing you can always do is coaching and feedback for your AEs, watching the calls, and just getting A+ in those interactions. Because at the end of the day, if you get really, really good on that and you're closing at a higher rate, your AEs are happy and they're making money, a lot of those other things will become easier to solve. So that's my advice.
Amazing. Greg, it was truly great to have you on the show. Really appreciate you um, sharing some advice on how sales leaders should think. And I learned a lot from this call personally too. And I'm
Good.
going to make some mental notes about how we do sales here as well. Where can people find you online if they're listening to this podcast and they want to reach out to you and talk to you? What's the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah, on LinkedIn, perfect. I have a Calendly tied to my LinkedIn. Shoot me a connection request. Shoot me a note. I think my profile's open. Or if you're feeling like you want to talk about something urgent, go ahead and book some time. I'm open for it for sure. So,
Amazing. Thanks, Greg.
yeah, thank you.